path for a Labour leader to follow, but I think at the moment he views that as being important to be in a position where they can win again and then bring in sort of radical changes that Clive talks about.
All right, well, before we get Clive into trouble, let's move on. It's more than 3 years since the Grenfell Tower fire, but many people are still living in buildings with dangerous cladding. Here's Greg.
You wake up every day worrying about it, every single day. And for me and my husband, that stress had so much more negative effect on our mental health than my cancer diagnosis has. The cladding crisis is having more of an effect on our lives than cancer.
Back in February, Politics Live reported on the plight of hundreds of thousands of people living in blocks judged to be a fire risk. Like Grenfell Tower, many of them are fitted with combustible cladding. But because that cladding wasn't the same as the material fitted to Grenfell, they didn't qualify for public funding. Leaseholders found themselves trapped. Their homes dangerous, their investment worthless. In Manchester, we met Matt, who, along with his wife, was facing enormous costs.
People have been quoted 20, 30, 40,000 pounds. That is money we simply don't have.
Then in March, a breakthrough.
2.5 years on, we're still grappling with the tragic legacy of Grenfell.
In his budget, the Chancellor announced more help was coming.
Today, I am creating a new building safety fund worth £1 billion. That new fund will go beyond dealing with ACM to make sure that all unsafe combustible cladding will be removed.
Yeah, I think it was.
But there was a caveat. Buildings under 18 metres were exempt, which means for Laura and Alex Pearce, nothing has changed. They bought their flat in this low-rise building in south-east London in 2016.
All of the white that you can see, that's all flammable and combustible cladding. All the balconies that you can see are timber, combustible, so that's why there are no cars that are allowed to be parked underneath there. There's also a real lack of fire breaks anywhere in the building, and yet the building was still deemed safe and fit for purpose when the building was signed off.
The building is deemed so dangerous that the London Fire Brigade insists on a 24-hour waking watch surveillance. To save thousands of pounds, the leaseholders voluntarily do the rounds themselves.
Who's doing the 2 a.m, the 3 a.m. shifts? It's on a voluntary basis, so everyone does some of the poorer shifts and some of the nicer shifts, I guess, really.
It's devastating. That's what we do in life. We work, we earn money, and then we buy a property, and that's where you're supposed to feel safe. You know, your home is a safe place. It's security. We have no security at the moment, both in terms of safety of our building or in terms of our financial security.
For Laura and Alex, the stress of living in an unsafe building is compounded with Laura's diagnosis of incurable breast cancer.
We currently feel really trapped. Of course, we are dealing with everything that goes with my cancer diagnosis and the fact that it is likely that I will have a shorter life. We want to make the most of the time we have left. We want to live for now, and currently we can't plan for the future. The strain on this is just overwhelming, and I don't think the government really realise the impact that this is having on individuals' lives.
This building is just a 2-minute drive from Laura's and is covered in ACM cladding, the type that was fitted to Grenfell Tower, and obviously it's also over 18 metres high. And for those reasons, it qualifies for the £1.6 billion of public money available to make those buildings safe. But critics say that pot of money is only enough to cover a third of buildings identified as high risk.
It'll probably cover about 600 of the 1,700 that currently have the cladding on them.
Clive Betts chairs the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, which recently called for the government to cover all the costs of making these buildings safe.
It really is a complete mess, and government needs to take control of the whole thing, but also say we will actually pay the money to get this sorted out. Nobody else is going to do it.
The Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government told this programme all building owners have a legal responsibility to ensure their buildings are safe, regardless of their height, and we're introducing the biggest changes to building safety rules for a generation to ensure people are safe in their homes. It is right we've prioritised funding for the removal of cladding from buildings over 18 metres, as they were identified as being of greater risk by the government's independent expert panel. But there are fears if building owners are expected to pay, many cases will take years to resolve, leaving the leaseholders in limbo.
government's first responsibility is the safety of its citizens. That's a prime duty. But when you've got a building that was built 10 years ago in the private sector, the developer's long gone and will argue in the courts forever about whether they're responsible for things. The freeholders often haven't got the resources. The leaseholders may be responsible in their lease for building maintenance, but they can't afford to pay. So if government doesn't step in, no one's going to do it.
So what about those buildings that are above 18 metres? 5 months after meeting him in Manchester, we caught up with Matt Holsworth about the situation for him and his wife. They've applied for some of that £1 billion fund for their building, but they don't think it will fix their problems.
It doesn't quite fulfill all the needs that people have. You know, we have things like fire breaks and compartmentation, which isn't covered in the fund itself. So there might still be a huge cost there that currently we're not actually legally protected from.
To date, dealing with the fire risks in his building has cost him more than £2,000, but he's worried things could get much worse.
There's people out there who have lost jobs, who have been furloughed, and they've still got those costs. That might still happen to us. It's so uncertain at the moment that that's kind of compounded that anxiety that we've felt over this.
Nikki, it's more than 3 years since Grenfell Tower went up in flames, and there are still huge numbers of people living in blocks of flats that are similarly at risk of fire. How do you explain to the residents of buildings under 18 metres why they're not covered by the government scheme?
Well, you heard in the report there, obviously, reference to the independent experts panel. It's not an area that I worked on, but I'm assuming it is something to do with, obviously, the height of the buildings and the way that people are potentially evacuated from them and the safety there. But the whole thing is, I mean, where it goes back to the first item we were discussing about people's frustrations, and I think ministers would share this as well, having heard them speak, which is how long this is all taking. I mean, you know, leaving aside the last couple of months, obviously, with the pandemic. And, you know, Robert Jenrick in May, amidst everything else, issued what's called a ministerial direction to his permanent secretary, saying, you know, he wanted more money spent and more pace in order to make this happen. Now, again, that was about buildings over 18 metres. I take the point about what's in the report.
Right, but should buildings under 18 metres be included in the government scheme, Nikki?
Well, I think ultimately it's going to have to be all unsafe cladding,
right.
Yes.
OK.
And I do think that actually, you know, as you said in the report, ultimately the cost, I mean, building owners should be replacing it, but if they won't, then the taxpayer, and we just had a discussion about the role of the taxpayer, the debt and everything else, but I still think government's going to have to step in.
Clive, just briefly, because we haven't got much time before PMQs, is this totally the government's problem to solve? You've just heard Nikki mention there. Some of these buildings are owned by freeholders and developers.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, look, when you put in organisations that maximise profit, that's their central goal. This is what's going to happen when you have a system that puts that first before anything else, people's safety included. They're going to drive costs down, and that's what they've done here. The people that built these should be the ones that the government take to court. Doesn't make a difference how long it is. They should be bankrolling this, taking those people to court and getting that money out of them and paying for these changes for the taxpayer to be able to fund this, because ultimately it's another market failure, isn't it? And it's people's lives that are being smashed. I'm seeing this in the pandemic. Small businesses, tenants, it's the landlords, the big corporate landlords, the landlords that get their rent, come what may, come COVID or hell or high water. It's a small person, the small business that has to pay for this, and it's exactly the same again with this. I'm
cutting in because we've lost your visual, we've lost your face, but we saw everybody else and something else, and we certainly heard everything you said, which is what's important.